come for Dr. Seuss. Tomorrow they come for your Bible and for Shakespeare.
There's a real problem with Amazon controlling 83% of book distribution.
Yeah.
And so when they cut something, they are acting as Big Brother censor. And there are books that they've taken off their platform that, they keep Mein Kampf on there, but there are books that they take off their platform for being too hateful.
Yeah. Yep. Listen, it is a problem when you have 5 major media companies and Amazon controlling all of the media forms in the whole country. I mean, that's what it basically is. News Corp, Disney, a couple of other corporations, and you have Amazon, which controls all the print media in the country. It's a problem. I just think, I remember those books. We read those books to our kids.
Sure.
I don't think that they're racist books any more than so many other things in the world are, but they're adorable. So I have my secret copies. Don't tell them.
You have some Aunt Jemima syrup in your secret fridge?
I do. As a matter of fact, I have Aunt Jemima syrup in my fridge. and Uncle Ben's rice and
right.
the cream of wheat guy, and
little black Sambo.
Remember Sambo's? Remember there was Sambo's. It was a restaurant. Remember?
Yes.
It was a coffee shop, and then they took off the little black part and made it Sambo's, and then they just made it Sam's, and then it disappeared altogether. Pretty soon the
direction we're going.
Pretty soon the IHOP. They're going to say IHOP is the international IHOP. It's a communist plot. You'll see.
Oh, you heard?
Oh yeah.
Dr. Seuss is actually anti-racist.
Have you ever the Sneetches? Remember the Sneetches?
Yes, that's very anti-racist.
With a star. I think it's a great book. Anyway, I'm not making political comments. Please don't write me angry emails. I am not trying to on either side. I think the left and the right are all nuts, but that's me. All right, welcome. It is Lunch and Learn for a Wednesday afternoon, and I'm delighted to welcome a group of dear friends who have found their way onto Zoom. And for all of the friends who have found their way onto YouTube and Facebook, we're glad you're here. We've been learning the books of Ketuvim, the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, in between our comments of social significance. And we've been working our way very slowly but methodically through the book of Job, which is the most complicated and difficult and challenging book, I think, in the entire Bible. And today we're going to reach the end of the book, or at least the final chapter, final discussion that we're going to have of this book. So it's the most complicated book for a number of reasons. Number one, it's the most complicated book because it presents us a variety of literary forms and genre. It begins with a prose tale, moves into poetry, and the poetry represents a dialogue. Then it moves into soliloquies, into speeches, monologues, and then it moves back to the prose tale. Now, it's certainly possible, of course, that an author would write in multiple genre, multiple forms. But what's interesting is that the philosophy, the ideas represented in each section differ from each other. So what we have here is not a book which points out a point of view, but rather an anthology, a set of literary traditions that have been brought together in order to explore what I think is the most important question of all religious life. And that question is the question of divine justice and a moral order. So we have first a prose tale, which offers its idea, which says that the only way to experience the difficulties of life is with a philosophy of radical acceptance. Everything that was given us, God gives us the good and God gives us the evil. Praise be the name of God. Or Job says, naked I came into the world and naked I leave. The prose tale, which offers that ideology of radical acceptance. Then we turn the page and we end up with 30 chapters or 37 chapters of dialogue. And the dialogue is a debate. And in this section, Job is not quiet and he's not accepting and he's not silent. He castigates and accuses God of injustice. And the question here is, can you hold God to a standard of human justice? Do we and God share a moral language so that you can say, as Abraham said to God, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? That's the question of the middle chapters of the book of Job. And he's met by these three friends, and then this fourth guy who was a neighbor. And they're going to maintain that there is divine justice and that Job is at fault, if not for sin, at least for hubris, for having even raised the question. And Job is going to cast doubt on all of that and say, I'm not a sinner, and this represents an aberration. It represents an injustice for which God is responsible. And that's the middle section of the book of Job. And then when we get to the end of the book of Job, there are two long speeches, one by Job and one by God. I call them testimony. And in Job's testimony, he says, he basically presents himself not to the friends and not to God, but to the community. And he says, I was always the upholder of justice in the community. Why isn't God upholding justice for me? I'm the one that maintained that the community has a responsibility to the downcast and the poor and the vulnerable. Why isn't God extending me the same courtesy? And he invites God at the end to come back and fix this. He says, you made a mistake. You included me. And when you punish the world, and I'm not to be included. And he asks God, without the castigating voice of the dialogues, he asks God to come and to rectify this mistake. And then we get God's response. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. That's what we're going to take a look at today. I'm going to suggest that in the different sections of the book, in the different kinds of literature that's presented, we have not one, but multiple different points of view trying to answer this fundamental question. Is there a moral order? Now, we know there's a natural order. Even ancient people, before they had science, before they had the whole vocabulary of science, could see that there's a natural order. Day follows night, follows day, follows night, winter, spring, summer, fall. There's a natural order to things in the world. We, with science, have come to understand what's the nature of that natural order. We have a theory called gravity, which gives us a very powerful picture of the way things work in the world. We understand weather, or at least the people on Channel 2 do when they give the thing at night. You know, we understand the biology of disease and health to an extent, but to a great extent, so that, you know, when this pandemic came, nobody blamed it on Jews poisoning the wells. I mean, the president blamed it on the Chinese, but that's another story. But we understand that this was a virus, and we know what a virus is. We even have pictures of the damn thing. We know how it spreads. We know how to keep it from spreading. And we have the facility to figure out how to create a vaccine. We have a powerful sense of the natural order and how it works. The question that the Bible asks is there a moral order that works in the same way, with the same intractability as the natural order in the world around us? So, you know, if you drop something from on high below, it falls. That's gravity. Is there a natural order that dictates that moral virtue will be rewarded? That if you're good, good things happen to you. And if you're sinful, punishments come your way. And that suffering is a product of your sin and therefore deserved? Is there such a moral order? The Bible, in the rest of its chapters, would like to maintain that there is. I mean, very clearly in the book of Deuteronomy, V'haya im shamoa tishma'u. If you will listen to God's word, follow God's ways, there will be rain, and you will gather your crops, and you will live a prosperous life. And if you go worship other gods, then terrible things will happen to you. The skies will shut themselves up, and you will starve. There is a moral order offered in the book of Deuteronomy. There is certainly a moral order offered in the Exodus, in the story of the Exodus, which is God's punishment on an arrogant Pharaoh for enslaving his people. And the book of Job says, can I count on a moral order? And the answer is no, there is not. And then the question is, why not? Isn't there a God? And here we arrive at a paradox, contradiction, dialectic. And here's the paradox. We want to believe two things, and they're not compatible. On the one hand, we do want to believe that there is divine justice, that there is a God who governs the world, and that God is just and good and powerful. We want to believe in divine justice. That was the whole basis of the Abraham story. Abraham says to God, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yasem mishpat, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? What he's saying is, we and God share a moral language. God sponsors, God mandates justice in the world. God has to act justly also. That's what Abraham's accusation is saying. God changes his mind and says, okay, you find me 50 good people in the city of Sodom and I'll let it go. Divine justice is one conviction. But the other conviction is divine otherness. The idea that God is not like us, that God is a whole nother layer of being, a whole nother level of being in the world. God is not like us in any way whatsoever. It's the meaning of the word Adonai Echad. One of the interpretations of Adonai Echad in the Shema is that God is unique, so that you can't impose a human moral standard on God. You can't ask God questions that you would ask a human being because God is different than we are. Well, the question is, which of these two convictions are you willing to side with? Because you can't have them both. If God is just, then that means that God is governed by the same moral order that you and I are governed by. And that therefore God is limited in God's freedom because God can't do something that's evil. Because good and evil apply to God, justice and injustice, right and wrong, innocence and guilt. The whole vocabulary of moral judgment applies to the divine as well. Or you say God is not like us. God is above, beyond, a whole different layer of being than we are. And you can't ask God those questions. Well, but if you can't ask God those questions, then you can't maintain that God is governing the world with any standard of justice, because God is beyond that whole language and judgment of justice. That's the whole idea here. So in our last testimony, in the end of the book, Job gives his testimony. And Job says in chapters 39 and 40, Job says, not 39 and 40, 29 and 30 and 31. Job says, is that right? I have it here. Let me look it up. Here it is, 29, right. Job says, I was the paragon of the community, right? I was the leader of the community, and I brought justice to this community, right? I was a father to the needy, and I looked to case a stranger. I broke the jaws of the wrongdoer and wrestled prey from its teeth. And I thought I would end my days with my family and live as long-lived as the phoenix, my roots reaching water and dew lying on the branches, my vigor refreshed, my bow ever new in my hand. He said, I lived the life of morality, and I expected to receive the rewards of that morality. And then he goes back and keeps reiterating how, his importance in the community. But what happened was, that's not what I got. That's not what happened to me. And there's something wrong, God. You got to fix it. And he still has a lot of confidence that there is a God in the world who is, in fact, the paragon of justice, the guarantor of justice, right? But he's waiting. He says, I cried out to you, but you didn't answer me. I wait, you don't consider me. You have become cruel to me. He says, God, what's wrong with you? You're not yourself. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, because you're supposed to be treating me the way I treated those below me. Those who were weaker, those who were vulnerable, those who were in trouble, I cared for them. You're supposed to be caring for me. You're supposed to be doing that for me. And then he charges God and asks these questions. Did I not weep for the unfortunate or grieve for the needy? I look forward to good fortune, but evil came. You're supposed to be doing that for me. Okay? And then in chapter 31, he offers his a set of oaths where he said, if I sinned, then I deserve my punishment. But I can't believe that I sinned this way. I can't believe that I did any of these things. And therefore, this I think is I'm sorry. He said, therefore, you owe me now, right? You owe me. Did I ever brush aside the case of my servant, man or maid? Notice the social hierarchy here, right? He is the master and he has a servant. But did I ever not consider the needs of my servants when they complained against me? Then what then should I do when God arises, when he calls me to account? What should I answer him? God is supposed to treat me with the kind of mercy and consideration that I treated my employees, those below me, right? Those below me. And he goes on and keeps talking about all the things that he did and asks God to treat him with the same kindness that he treated those who were his social lessers, those below him on the social hierarchy. And he says, if I did violate these things, I deserve my punishment, but I didn't, and you know I didn't, and therefore I deserve rectification here. Okay? That's his last speech. And then God shows up. Now, here's the interesting thing about God showing up. In the rest of the Bible, when God shows up, that's the end of the story. Right? In the Exodus story, when God shows up, that's the end of the story. I mean, you sort of expect it. I mean, because God is sort of the climax, right? But not here in Job. Here in Job, the voice of God is going to offer us another piece of this. So whereas Job truly believed in a God who held on to justice, you're going to see in just a moment that the God we meet in the end of the book of Job is a God who totally represents otherness. That sense that God is not to be judged, not to be castigated, because God is outside of our reality and therefore can't possibly be judged by us. You're going to see that all of Job's metaphors, all of his language is very domestic. He talks about his home and the village square and the shared spaces that human beings inhabit. But when you talk about God, you're going to be talking about a cosmos much bigger. The spatial vista of the divine speech here is going to be remarkable. And when you talk about Job, Job talks about all the people he took care of. When God speaks, God's not going to be speaking about things he takes care of. It's about the wild things, the things that are beyond caring for. God's speech is going to take us from the settled, organized, domestic world that we know we live in to a very different world, to a world of chaos and power, to a world of vast, vast vistas beyond our understanding. He's never going to answer Job. He's never going to say, okay, let me tell you why you're suffering. He doesn't ever tell him that. What he tells him is, I'm not you. I'm nothing like you. You're nothing like me. You have no right to judge me. All you can do is be quiet and just perceive. And the question at the end of the book is going to be, is that at all satisfying? Is that an answer to Job's castigation? So let's take a look inside. Unless anyone has a question to start with. Let me make sure this before we dump into the text. Anyone got questions so far? That was a recap of where we've been. So, got questions? Okay, let's jump inside. Ready? So right away, you're going to see from the very first line what we're dealing with. Chapter 38. Then the Lord replied to Job out of the tempest. What's a tempest? A hurricane, a storm. Not just a storm, like a mama's storm, like a hurricane. Now remember, when God speaks to Elijah on the mountain, it's a still small voice. When God speaks to Abraham, it's a voice of a friend, right? When God speaks to Moses, it's a consultation. This isn't a consultation or a friend. This isn't the still small voice. This is a hurricane. God shows up in a hurricane. You ever been in a hurricane? Anyone ever been in a big storm, like a huge storm, like a storm that was like way beyond you? And there's a feeling you get. There's an immediate feeling you get. I've ever been on a camping trip and been outside in one of these storms, living in a tent or just standing under a tree. There's this tremendous sense of being outside. You've lost control. This is not a circumstance that you have any control over. You're just going to have to withstand this and get through it. Okay, Douglas, you want to say something?
No.
Okay. So let's jump into the hurricane. God talks to him not in the still small voice of Elijah or the friendly voice he talks to Moses. God talks to him, or the fatherly voice he talks to Jeremiah. He talks to him out of the tempest, out of the hurricane. Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man. I will ask and you inform me. That's the opening, right? Remember, what was it? Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. You talking to me? You talking to me? Or Joe Pesci in Wise Guys, right? Who is this guy? You know, who are you? Who do you think you are? And then he begins. And we're going to see a series now of images. And I want you to see this not as an argument, but as a slideshow. Think of the images, the visual images that are being presented. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Speak if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions, or who measured it with a line? Unto what its bases were sunk? Who set its cornerstone? So the first section is all about the foundations of the world. When the morning stars sang together and all divine beings shouted for joy. The foundations of the earth. Where were you? Now we go to the sea. Who closed the sea behind doors when it gushed forth out of the womb? When I clothed it in clouds, swaddled it in dense clouds. When I made breakers my limit for it, and set up its bars and its doors, and said, you may come so far and no farther. Here your surging ways will stop. Now the image, this image, by the way, this beautiful little image, swaddled it in dense clouds. God diapering the sea as if you diaper a baby. I mean, what do you diaper a baby to, protect it and keep it clean, but also to sort of to give it a place, so it can be in the world, but not other place. You put a baby in a crib so you know where he is. He doesn't crawl away. Here's God setting a space for the sea. So first the foundations of the earth, and then the setting of the sea. Have you ever commanded the day to break? Assign the dawn its place so that it sees the corner of the earth and shake the wicked out of it. So the next one is about the daytime, right? And now we go down to here. Have you ever penetrated the sources of the sea? We go beneath the known world to a subterranean, underground foundations of reality, or walk the recesses of the deep. Have the gates of death been disclosed to you? Have you seen the gates of the deep darkness? Have you surveyed the expanse of the earth? If you know this stuff, tell me, he says, right? Which path leads to where light dwells? What a great line. Like, where does light come from? And where is the place of darkness that you may take it to the domain and know the way it's home, right? And then if you turn, then you go down here to 22. Now we turn to the weather. So we did foundations of the earth and the sea, and then the deeper foundations of reality. And now we get to weather. Have you ever penetrated the vaults of snow? Like where God keeps all the snow stored up, right? Seen the vaults of hail, which I put aside for a time of adversity, for a day of war and battle. But what path the west wind is to, like, do you know where the weather comes from? Do you know where weather comes from? And then he moves from weather to the constellations of the sky. Can you tie cords of Pleiades or undo the reins of Orion? These are constellations in the sky, right? Clouds and lightning come next. Do you know the laws of heaven impose authority on earth? Can you set up an order to the clouds? And then the most interesting thing is he gets down here and he moves from all of that amazing stuff in the creation to the animals. And notice the animals that they choose to present to us. Again, don't think of this as an argument. Think of this as a set of visual images, all of which move you out of your sense of comfort that I know the world I live in, into that sense of insecurity and strangeness when you're faced with something much bigger than yourself that is beyond your comprehension. Remember being in Boy Scout camp or Girl Scout camp and sleeping out under the stars. You unroll your sleeping bag and you look up at the vast canopy of stars above you and you feel very, very, very small. That's his understanding. Can you hunt prey for the lion and satisfy appetite for the king of beasts? You go down a little bit, you go from lions to ravens, and then from ravens to mountain goats, which are these wild animals that fill the desert in the Sinai. The wild ass is an interesting one. We don't have a lot of those in my neighborhood. We got porcupines. I got skunks. I got possums. We just discovered some bunny rabbits living around here. But imagine living in a place where these wild horses, wild donkeys, and listen to the way that they describe him, right? Who set the wild ass free, who loosed the bonds of the onager, whose home I made in the wilderness, the salt land, his dwelling places. The ass, he scoffs at the tumult of the city, does not hear the shouts of the driver. This is a specifically a deliberately undomesticated beast, a beast that will not accept a saddle, a beast that will not be tamed. All of these images of wildness, he presents in front of Job, and he says to him at the end of this long visual tour of the wild universe, he says, he goes back to that same refrain, shall one who should be disciplined complain against Shaddai? Shaddai's God. He who arraigns God must respond. And Job responds by saying, I am of small worth. What can I answer you? I clap my hand to my mouth. I've spoken once and will not reply, twice and will not do so more. And then he goes to one more set of images, right? And the images are God's own power and two mythical beasts, the behemoth and the Leviathan. The behemoth is a mythical ox of enormous proportions that lives somewhere on the other side of the mountain. And he goes where he wants and does what he wants. And he's God's favorite pet, right? Now take now behemoth, whom I made as I did you. He eats grass like the earth, his strength in his loin, his muscles of his belly. And he goes on this huge amount, this description of this enormous animal that can't be tamed. And then he goes to Leviathan. Leviathan is the sea monster, the great sea monster. Can you drop Leviathan like a fishhook? And Leviathan also, even God says, I can't tame him, right? Even God says he's beyond my control. Right? Any hope of capturing him must be disappointed. One is prostrated by the very sight of him. There's none so fierce as to rouse him. Who then can stand up to me? Who confronts me, I will requite. So he takes Job on a tour of the wildness of the universe, just the complete wildness of the universe. And he keeps asking him, where were you? Where were you? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? And at the very end of this treatment, what happens? Job gives in. Job, who has been so vociferous for so many chapters, Job gives in. Job says in reply to the Lord, I know you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures counsel without knowledge? Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I did not know. Here now I will speak. I ask you, inform me. I have heard you with my ears. Now I see you with my eyes. Therefore, I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. Job says, I give up. So what God does here is so interesting because he doesn't answer him. He displaces the whole question. He reframes the whole question. And the voice of God at the end of the book of Job says, you and I don't live in the same universe. You and I don't inhabit the same level of being. You and I are completely different. You aren't in a place where you can question me. You aren't in a place where you can question me because you live, and I live in completely different moral universes, completely different physical universes. So all you can do is stand in awe at the world that I live in and accept it as it's given to you. But you can't impugn my justice because justice doesn't apply to me the way it applies to you. And Job's response is, okay. Pretty much that same feeling we all had when we slept under the stars as kids at camp. The sense of being so small and accepting that smallness and not rebelling against it because you can't push it back. and you realize that you're not in a place where you can even ask the question. It's a displacement of Job from the center of the universe to its periphery. It's a putting him, literally putting him in his place. Putting him in his place. And that's the way the book ends. So the book says, I'm not going to tell you. Job never finds out in the book why he suffered. God never justifies his suffering. God never justifies it, whether it was a judgment or just an accident. We know the prose tale has its answer about why it happened, but in the poetry, he never answers the question, why do good people suffer? He doesn't even say to Job, you deserved it. He simply says, I refuse to accept the question. I refuse to accept the question because the question doesn't apply to me. I am on another level of being. And the question is, what is the book telling us at the end? It doesn't resolve the problem. It doesn't answer us. It still leaves us with the paradox that a God of justice and a God who is other can't live together. It's an incongruent idea. And the most that you can get out of it is a sort of acceptance of the tragic element of being a human being. If, in fact, the world is so much bigger than we can understand, then whatever rules by which it's governed are not the moral rules we normally associate with. And therefore, we'll never be satisfied. And therefore, we have to accept the fact that bad things will happen to good people because it's that kind of a world. And there is no sense of justice. And there is no righteousness. There is no reward, sure reward for righteousness. There's no moral order at the end. And therefore, human life retains a sort of quality of the tragic. And in retaining a quality of the tragic and accepting that, that's the most. Acceptance is the most that one can have at the end. And if you remember how the prose tale ended at the very, very beginning, he makes this comment when his wife says, curse God and die. He says, look, naked I was when I came into the world, and naked I am when I leave. God gives and God takes away, and all I can do is bless God. And you can see here that at the end of this conversation, this dialogue between Moses and God, Job and God, that's sort of where Job is left, right? All I can do is accept, because there is no questioning. But then, is that enough? Is that enough, or does that leave you unsatisfied even there? So let's stop for a second and sort of take this in, okay? I got Stanley Schroeder, then Stan Garber, and then Douglas. Okay, so Schroeder and then Bert. Okay, Stanley Schroeder, you're up first, and then David.
Using Rabbi Schulweiss's theology of ending the prayers by, through me, can you apply that theology to this type of question and say, don't ask questions about God, because all you're doing is asking questions about yourself through yourself? Well,
I wouldn't put it this way. So the book of Job and Rabbi Schulweiss disagree about one fundamental idea. Okay, Rabbi Schulweiss would say that we are created in the image of God and carry God within us, so that we participate in the life of God. The book of Job says God is other. God is not us. We are not God. We confront God. We can talk to God, but we don't participate in the life of God in the way that Rabbi Schulweiss would say. Okay, so that's the biggest difference. Here, however, there is a connection, and here's the connection. When you listen to Job's testimony in chapters 29 and 30 and 31, where he says, I was the one that protected the needy and the vulnerable and the poor and the weak, and that's what I expect of God. So Rabbi Schulweiss would fasten upon Job's testimony and say, that is God's place in the world. That the only answer to the question is not to look into the heavens and expect God to give you an answer from the hurricane. The only answer to the question is, if you don't like the unfairness of the world, if you think that the world is unjust, if you cry at the tragic fate of human beings to live in a world which is random and arbitrary, fix it. You have the tools to do something about it, right? You have the tools to find a vaccine for a pandemic. You have the tools to heal the sick. You have the tools to feed the hungry. You can't eliminate all of the contingency, all of the randomness, all the evil, all the pain of being a human being, but you can do a hell of a lot about it. And that's your answer to the question. That's the activist answer to the question. That's where Schulweis and the Book of Job find their commonplace. Okay? Stan Garber, you're next.
Back 100 years ago, when I was going to Talmud Torah, and questions like this arose, the traditional answer was, it'll be taken care of in the Olam Haba.
Right.
Okay. You don't hear that so much anymore.
Well, you don't hear it here. You don't hear it in this book, because the Olam Haba is an idea that came to the Jewish people later. It's not an idea that occurs in the look. If Olam Haba existed as an idea, then this had been a very short book. Job would say, "I'm suffering. I'm a good person," and God would have shown up and said, "Yes." And in the next world, are you going to have a birthday party? I mean, my God, and that would have been the end of the book. The whole idea of a next world doesn't occur to the Jewish tradition until much later, till we meet the Persians, and that we in the 5th century. And then we pick up this idea of Olam Haba, and then Olam Haba becomes Olam Haba means the world to come. And the world to come can mean two things, by the way. It can mean your life after your death, heaven and hell, or it can also mean the world after the Messiah arrives, in which case there is a judgment and a rectification of everybody's fate. So whether you believe it's at the end of history or whether you believe it's the end of our personal lives, that is one of the ways that the Jewish tradition tried to answer the irresolution of the Book of Job, the unresolved, unended argument of the Book of Job, because it tells you, okay, it's going to work out okay. Maybe not right now, but you'll see in the next world it'll work out. The problem with that, of course, is, first of all, nobody knows for sure. And second of all, the problem is that we still suffer. And the wonder is like, but why would God let us suffer now? Well, to give you a bigger reward in the world to come. Okay. I mean, that's an idea. But the Bible doesn't know that idea, number one. And number two, I think it's a problematic idea on its face. Right. I see why, I know why people believe in it and I know that it gives hope to many people. And the Christians are going to build a whole religion on it. I mean, it's the whole idea of embrace Christ and live forever. Right. But here, you don't have it here in this book. You don't have it here in this book. When I went to Talmud Torah and when he asked questions like this, we got smacked and told we were wise guys and should shut up and go back to learning diktuk. Right. So I didn't learn theology and I didn't learn diktuk. I didn't learn either one. You went to a better Talmud Torah than me. That's for sure. Okay, good. Who's next?
The traditional answer was Maternit Fragen.
Yeah, Maternit Fragen. Yeah. And but it would always come with a smack on the back of the head in my world, in my Talmud Torah. It wasn't gentle. It was like, wise guy trying to get us off the topic, right? Douglas, go ahead.
You spend a lot of
Right,
time.
a flexible yardstick.
Right. Go ahead, please.
You spend a lot of time going through these flowery metaphors and this poetic imagery.
Yes.
4 chapters could be summed up with 4 words. Shut up, you, okay. And of course that is unsatisfying. And I think what I would point to is something I read in the semi-autobiography of Herman Wouk, Sailor Fiddler, where he describes what he went through to write the character of Aaron Jastrow in War and Remembrance. And he was the philosopher who gives this speech about that Job being a metaphor for the Jewish people. That, that we're the ones who suffered throughout history and yet refuse to curse God. And, and yet every time I read this book, I go, I just want to pull my hair out and, look, I don't have enough.
Yeah. I think that your response is more true. You could see this as a metaphor for the Jewish people, but I don't think so. And I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. The name Job, I do baby namings for kids. So, I name Mordechai's and Esther's and Sharona's and Yirmiyahu's and Yaakov's and Avram's and Moshe's. And in English, of course, they have all these very creative names now, a lot of Taylors and Mackenzies. And for a while, it was very popular to name your kids for streets in Manhattan. So I had Lexington's and Madison's and Fifth and Park, Yeah. But I've never named a kid Job. Not one, ever. Because Job is not a Hebrew name. Eov is an Akkadian name. Because these stories were older than the Bible. They originated in ancient, in cultures that were more ancient than ours. And in the Akkadian language, which is the oldest Mesopotamian language, the name Eov means everyman. John Doe. He is a cipher for the common experience of our humanity. He's not Jewish. It's not a Jewish book. He is a person who confronts God in the world. And notice how he meets God. You see, at the end of the book, how does God convince him to shut up? He shows him images of nature. Nature has no morality. Nature doesn't know you're a good person or a bad person. It rains or it's drought on your lawn, whether you're a mitzvah keeper or not. I mean, I pray, but it doesn't happen that way. I'd like to see my lawn be greener than my neighbor's because I keep more mitzvahs, but it don't work that way, Nature is morally obtuse, more uninterested in our morality. And that's the world that Job lives in. Now, what happens here is that God takes him on this tour of nature, especially the wild things of nature, the awesome parts of nature, in order to displace him from the center of the conversation to its periphery, to give him a sense of his smallness, so that he understands that the question is no longer appropriate, that it's no longer welcome, that it's not the question you ought to be asking. Because when you get a sense of how big the universe really is and how small you are, you don't look at the world the same way. You don't ask the same kind of questions that he asks. And that's the difference. Abraham is a different character. Abraham is covenanted. I mean, I think that Abraham and Job are really two opposites, because Abraham is allowed to ask the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Because Abraham has a covenant with God in which God picked him and said, I need you to represent my justice in the world. He gets to talk to God that way because he's God's business partner. Job is not. Job is just every schmo on the street who experiences God through the experiences of his own life and discovers that the world doesn't pay much attention to him. Maimonides writes a very interesting comment about this. Maimonides says that the answer of the book of Job is to recognize that you're a very small part of a very large system called nature. And most of the time when we're complaining about bad things, we're complaining about things of nature. Nature doesn't say, let's see how I can give Feinstein a good day today, or let's see how I can give Workman a bad day today. Nature just does nature. The COVID virus doesn't know that you're a lovely Jew. The COVID virus is looking for somebody to infect so it can live on. I mean, Maimonides says that the book of Job just says nature's oblivious to us. So why do you expect it to be moral? And God doesn't mess with that. That's the interesting part. So that's a different way to read it. That's a different way to read it. Bert Siegel, you're next.
Okay.
I'll get to everybody, I promise.
I have two connected, what I think are connected thoughts.
Wonderful.
The second one is I'm happily jumping on the Schulweis fix-it bandwagon. But to do that, I have to also believe there's some underlying thing that's making me feel that's, quote, the right thing to do. Whether it's God-given or just a gut feeling. Okay, that's the second piece. The first piece is what I get out of the end of the Job story, cynically, is why bother? Why pray? It's not going anywhere. It might make me feel good, but there's no result because he's, quote, not interested in what my problems are. He has much bigger problems because I'm so small. With that kind of attitude, I can cynically say, I understand the Holocaust. I understand the temples being pulled down, etc. So I got to go back to the second thing. I'm going to jump on the make it better, but feel that there's an underlying, influence, real or not, or imagine, that makes me feel like it's the quote right thing to do. So the fact that I no longer think I can pray and get anywhere outside of personally feeling good is okay. Done.
If you think that prayer is going to yield you better results in the world, right? Number one, you're going to be disappointed. This I can tell you for sure. And number two, I think that it's not the right way to pray. And look, everybody prays that way. When I'm driving down the freeway and I see a red light in my rearview mirror, I pray. Make it an ambulance, mine, and I pull over to the right and an ambulance zips by me and I say, Baruch Hashem. I do that. You do that, right? When I get an envelope that says IRS on the outside, I pray. I mean, all of us pray like that because it's a natural thing. But listen, if that's the way prayer is, you understand prayer, number one, you're going to be disappointed. And number two, that's superstition. That's prayer as a rabbit's foot, right? I mean, I always love those, those football games where the guy comes and says, dear Lord, let the boys play hard and let them win this week again. Oh, in the name of the Father and the Son, like, poor God, he has to hear a prayer from both sides of the field. I mean, who's God supposed to choose, So what does God do? He takes the Buccaneers, but gives you the points. I mean, what do you want out of my? I mean, come on. You pray because you want to feel the presence of God in your life, and you pray because you want to gain a sense of courage to do the things you want to do. You pray for means, not for ends. I mean, see, you have it exactly right. And the Schulweis answer is exactly an answer that's tailored for a generation that experienced not what Job experienced, but experienced the Holocaust, which is what Job experienced times 6 million or 11 million. And what Schulweis then says is, look, I can't look into the sky and find a God. I just can't. So where am I going to look and find a God? But I can find a God within the moral courage and the moral responsibility of human beings. And that's where I find my God. That's where I locate divinity. That's where I locate that which is of most precious and value to me. And I think it's a very nice answer. Somebody's phone's making a lot of noise. Bye. So that's where Schulweis comes down. So I appreciate what you said. Thank you for your theology. David, I think you're next.
It's very interesting conversation. And I think that as I'm listening more and more, that this section, which I never understood in Job, is a challenge to us, to me, a big challenge, a lifetime challenge. The thing that you brought up about praying, that it's not a police car or whatever we pray for. It really comes much more down to earth. I appreciate, and I remember Rabbi Schulweis saying, what, do you think God needs your prayers? That kind of thing. But that religion is not a child, that this is not a child's game. And the child asks for, I want a new toy, I want this, I want that, I want the girlfriend, I want the, whatever it is, I want the grade, I want to be this, and that's all, that's fine. There's a time and a place for that, but this is not a child's game, is what I'm getting. And that it is challenging me and everyone to not look at religion as a way of getting what you want. It seems like, and I don't want to make this a lecture, I want to hear your response, but it seems more and more, that when I study Torah, whenever, that it's a blueprint to guide me, to point me in a certain direction of how to live my life. And that when I do pray and I ask for help, the help comes to me in this very quiet, quiet voice it's almost like, well, maybe I should. And there's sort of a moment when I think, when I think something new that's better than what I've been thinking, and I go in a direction I've never gone before, and it keeps working. I grew up with the idea, of course, that God was a punishing God. You better do this, and if you do that, God will give you the rain and the crowd, all that stuff. And that's not how I read it. I just think that you live the best life you can live, and you do the best you can, and you have a certain level of faith that things will work out, and most things do work out. But they don't always work out. People get sick, and bad things happen, and that's not God's fault. That's just life. And to accept that and to do the best I can and to ask for guidance and to have humility. A lot of what you're talking about to me is about the incredible humility of getting how small you are in the scheme of things. And I don't want to believe that. I think I'm the center of things. So that was my lecture, my other lecture. But I appreciate what people have said and what you pointed out, and anything you want to say about no, yes, elaborate. But it's real grow. It's an incredible challenge that's not going to be solved in today's conversation. It's an ongoing challenge to not be a child about this.
I think that you're pointing to something when we first started this about 4 or 5 weeks ago, this book, I asked you this question, that at the end I was going to ask you, what do you think is the viewpoint of the person who put this book together? Whether we consider it a writer or a redactor, an editor, somebody made this book a book. Look at what he or she put into this book. And what do you think their viewpoint was? What were they trying to do I mean, at the very least, it's obvious that they're trying to say, when someone suffers, don't make it worse. At the very least, this is a warning to those who would say and do all of those things that would increase the suffering of the next person. So I think that's a very important piece of this. But the bigger question is, what is the theology of the person who put this together? He says, look, here is the human condition. And the human condition rests on a terrible paradox. On the one hand, we want the world to be fair. We really do want a world to be fair. We want to be treated well. We grew up with parents, and they loved us and protected us. We want to be loved and protected. We want the world to be fair to us. On the other hand, the world is not fair. This is a picture of the human condition. As I read this story, the book, at the end of the story, the human condition is very tragic. It's fraught. It's scary. It's vulnerable. Now, how do you live in that? How do you create meaning in that circumstance? How do you live with hope in that circumstance? How do you not give up in that circumstance? How do you move forward in life in that circumstance? So, and I think the book, what it does is it generates a bunch of really interesting questions, right? One of the answers is the one that Stan Schroeder pointed out, which is Rabbi Schulweiss's notion, which is this is an invitation to activism. You don't like the world you live in? Fix it. If you object to the tragic nature of the human condition, ameliorate it. Bring healing, bring peace, bring wisdom. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is learn to accept what you can't fix. That's another way to look at it. I don't know the answer to the question, David. I just really appreciate the way that you framed it, and I think this is part of the story is trying to. What did the author of this book want us to take home? What did the author want us to take home at the end?
And okay? I just wanted to say that I don't see it as hopeless. I'm afraid to say this. I do see miracles occurring in my life.
No, of course we all do. I mean, even Job does. I mean, that's what Job in his last testimony talks about the things that brought him a sense of satisfaction. He does too. And what we're going to do, I was going to do Ecclesiastes next, Kohelet, but it's like another depressing book. So I think we're going to move to something fun like Esther, just to get out of this mindset. And then we'll come back to Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes in Kohelet, called Ecclesiastes in English, is asking a similar kind of question. And he's going to come up with he's going to give us a very directive answer. And then we're going to ask whether his answer is the right answer, whether his answer is really the right answer. Andy, you're up next.
So in the beginning, when we started this book, I go back on, how I was taught, and I was very young. So I keep remembering all the optimistic and the small stories, like I want to say almost the sub stories of Job. You learn to be pious and respect God and follow the traditions and so forth. And at the end, I was always taught, yeah, you know what? That's what happened. He got back into the good graces. And that was how I remember it. Learning it now, I'm just thinking of all the therapy I could have saved, because basically it's life, there is no manual. You can do everything right and things can go wrong. That's what's going to happen. The kicker is, how do you handle it going forward? Once we hit that point, the bottom point, or when it's changing, how do you dust yourself off? How do you act towards people, God, anything, animals? I mean, it was a really eye-opening and enlightening to me on how, okay, once you recover from that, what do you do? And that was my say on it.
I appreciate it. So let me ask you this question, just to push you, because I really appreciate the way you express that. If you were to move this to a personal level, you think about a time in your life, all of us have faced moments of tragedy, when things happen that shouldn't have happened. Things happen that hurt us. Things happen where we lost somebody or something that was precious to us. And we walked around for some time in a cloud and walked around feeling that life was so difficult. And then think about, where do you gain the resilience to move out of that and back into a world of meaning, back into a world of hope? What brought you out of it? Okay, that's the question. Now, and that's what's in some ways one of the things, for example, that's missing from Job. Job has these three friends who come and make his life harder. What if he had real friends? I mean, when I was mourning my mom, people came for Shiva and held me and lifted me up. When I had my own catastrophes in my life, people lifted us up. So there's no social context. There's a community that's missing here, right? That's one of the things that, children lift us up. Like, one of the best ways that God distracts us from catastrophe is by putting crying babies in our arms. And suddenly you have that in your life. You're responsible for this creature whose life is beginning, and you look at that person and you can't help but feel something tender and loving. I mean, think about the ways in which we heal from the experiences of loss. And that's another one of the things that are missing at the end of the book is all right, so the wisdom is what then? What do you do next? But I really like the way you did that. Thank you. Sandy, you're next. Sandy, you're next. You have to unmute.
Unmute, okay.
Thank you.
First of all, I think that it was interesting that you talked about your friends, because you didn't talk about Elihu, who speaks for 4 chapters, 4 verses afterwards. And in between, when Job is through and God speaks, and he defends God, and he doesn't take Job's side. He defends him mightily. And I think that, and God dismisses him, and totally, he doesn't even answer him. He just talks to Job.
Right.
And then he talks to the Eliphaz and says, and your 2 friends. I mean, he doesn't even mention his name. Here he is, he's been talking for 4 chapters, and then he punishes them. Then he punishes his friends. So you see, there was some justice there to somebody else. Yeah. It's a very living, I think what it teaches us is that we have to live with the paradox, is that this is, and I think that we're better and more attuned to things. I think we understand some things because of this paradox. We don't have an out like some people do, like the Christians do. No, it's not explained for us. You have to live with it and go forward. That's the way I see it.
I appreciate that. I mean, that's another way to think about it. I don't see that what's really interesting is this is a book without resolution. Most books have an ending, and you say, okay, good. E.T. goes back to the spacecraft, and Dorothy goes back to Kansas, and you know, Ishmael goes back to the whaling city, and you know, books end with a resolution. This book
No.
has no resolution at the
Yes,
end.
but that's like Elie Wiesel's play in The Madness of God.
Yeah.
And the child is there torn between the father and the grandfather. And you have to live with that. What decision will he make?
Right. Guys, I know that you want to say more, but we need to call it because it's late now. So thanks for listening. I think what we're going to do next is take a break from Job and heavy things. I want to do Ecclesiastes. I want to do Kohelet, but I think I need a break. So I think what we're going to do next is skip and do something like Esther, which we just did it for Purim, because it's a goofy book and it's a fun book. It does have a serious side, which we'll learn together. But I'm just in the mood for a Humintash, and I'm in the mood for a little sweetness and a little joy before we jump into yet another heavy, serious book of wisdom. So I think that's going to be our curriculum for the next session. So let me wish everybody a really pleasant afternoon.
What's on store for tonight?
Oh, tonight. Oh, good. So tonight I'm beginning the College of Jewish Studies is back on. It has been resurrected. We're on again. And I'm going to do a short course called The Questions That Won't Go Away. This will be one of the questions, but we won't get to it a little bit later. Tonight, I want to begin with the question of what's the meaning and purpose of Jewish existence? Something easy in 45 minutes. Okay. So come and join me tonight. And Wednesday nights at 7:00, we're going to take a question a night. We'll do.
Is there a link?
Yeah, it's on the VBS website.
Thank you.
Go to the VBS website and look for College of Jewish Studies. There's a really cute picture of me and a nice yellow flyer. It's also on the on the email that went out. If you can't find it, Bert, come on down. I'm 2 doors down. Come on down. You sit here.
I'll bring my mask.
Yeah, no, come on. If you can't find it, email me and I'll send it to you. 7:00 Wednesday nights. Everyone's invited. It's free, of course, and we serve refreshments in your kitchen. So go ahead and help yourself. And it will only last 45 minutes to an hour. And we'll do a question a night. So we'll start with why the Jews? How odd of God to choose the Jews, as Ogden Nash once said. Okay, next week we'll talk about who is God. We'll talk about the meaning of good and evil like this. We'll talk about, is the Torah true? We'll talk about the nature of the state of Israel. One question a night until we run out of questions. Okay? Stay well, everybody. Take care. Be gesund.